South Africa faces a complex economic downturn and schedule, even as the landscape with the credit contraction is set to be a cautious borrowing and involving employment pattern scheme that we've seen. Now, recent data from the South African Reserve Bank indicates changes and challenges in the economic landscape, with the private sector credit growth slowing to about 4.38% year-on-year, below expectations, signaling cautious borrowing due to high interest rates and economic uncertainty. Household credit eased to 5.8% in August, reflecting strained finances and reduced consumer confidence. Corporate credit also dropped from 6.8% in July to 4%, highlighting challenges for businesses. Similarly, despite positive job figures in the second quarter of the year, as Stats SA says, the economy is shedding full-time jobs, emphasizing a shift to part-time roles. This morning, joining me from Potchefstroom in South Africa is Raymond Parsons, who's the Professor of Economics, Northwest University Business School. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
And good day to you.
Now, help us paint a picture of what the business climate in South Africa looks like currently.
Well, I think one would call it challenging but resilient. And I say that because you must remember that the latest growth forecast for South Africa, especially from our Reserve Bank, our central bank, is that this year the South African economy will grow at probably 0.7%, next year at 1%, and the year after maybe close to 1.5%. Now, that is better than many have expected, and it's something that South Africa wants to build upon. Of course, it's not enough for a country like South Africa, which has enormous socioeconomic challenges, as you know. But I think what is important here, when I talk about resilience, is that there's close cooperation between government and business now in three crucial areas that are important for higher growth in South Africa. The first is we want to keep our lights on. As you know, we had big problems with our parastatal called Eskom. There are also problems with our ports and our railways, which need to be sorted out. And there's the issue of crime. Many of these issues, I'm quite sure, are common to what many other countries in Africa are experiencing. But we're saying, well, we need to unblock these so that we can grow more rapidly, create more jobs, strengthen the business climate, and see that we get the investment that South Africa needs in order to build higher growth. And fortunately, there are signs that our fixed capital formation is beginning to lift its head again after the COVID-19 shock and also some of the global shocks of the last year or so. So I would say, to sum it up, it's a challenging business environment, but it has strong elements of resilience on which we intend to build.
Breaking it down further, Professor, let's look at the private sector. Data from the SA Reserve Bank show that the private sector credit extension only advanced by 4.38% year-on-year, compared with a 5.87% increase in July. Now, although this is the 26th straight month of growth in the private sector, it is said to be the lowest since February, 2022. So what would you attribute this to?
Well, I think when we look at the credit trends, we've got to see them in the broader context. And not surprisingly, South Africa, like several other countries, has had to deal and adjust to certain global shocks of the last year or so, both from a geopolitical point of view and from trends in the world economy. We've had the Russia-Ukraine war, which has resulted in inflation in many parts of the world, which has led many central banks to have to push up interest rates, as you referred earlier in your introduction. We're not over that phase yet. So quite clearly, there are global factors together with local factors which have compelled our central bank to also put up interest rates, because our inflation a few months ago was getting out of hand, outside the target range, the inflation target range of our central bank. And for the time being, it seems to me that those trends that you've referred to are now showing up in the credit demand, that both inflation and higher borrowing costs are exacting a price in terms of household and business finances.
Professor, you've talked about the factors that influence the hiking of interest rates, but then South Africa's inflation dipped towards the central bank's midpoint target range. Interest rates, which was said to have remained at a 14-year high at 8.25% per annum. So I'd like to find out, don't you think it is time for the Apex Bank to start easing the rates now?
I think it's probably premature in terms of our central bank's mandate to think of interest rates coming down. And this, I think, also resonates with a couple of other countries where the inflation dragon has not quite been slain. Now, we did have some better news in South Africa in the last few months that inflation was beginning to come down to within the target range of our central bank, which is 3 to 6%. However, in the month of August, we saw an uptick again, both in factory inflation and consumer inflation. And it is clear to me that our central bank will want to keep interest rates higher for longer until it's absolutely certain that it is meeting its mandate and that inflation will, on a sustainable basis, be well anchored within the target inflation range. So I think we must accept that as far as South Africa is concerned, and this is also true, for example, for the United States, that interest rates will remain high for longer than might have been originally anticipated.
Let's now take a look at the broader employment conversion. We have seen an increase in part-time jobs compared to full-time jobs in the country. What factors would you say are actually driving the shift in the employment landscape? Are there macroeconomic indicators or policies influencing this substantial growth in part-time jobs?
Well, I think the important point here is that you can't detach employment prospects and the structure of the employment prospects from what has been happening in the economy as a whole. So, what I would say is that, as you rightly said, there's not only global uncertainty, but in South Africa, we have elevated levels of policy uncertainty, which we want to see reduced. But as long as they are at that level, and as long as we are still talking about a growth of 0.7% and maybe 1%, it's inevitable that in that climate, in that business climate, it's not going to be possible to offer people full-time jobs. It's inevitable that you have to have an adjustment within the labor market to a transitional phase until you get to much higher growth rates. So what you're looking at, whether we're talking on the energy front or the employment front or in other areas where a country like South Africa has to cope with both external and internal shocks to its economy, what you are seeing emerging, and that's why I come back to my earlier point about resilience, and that is also reflected to some extent in the labor market. There are coping strategies that an economy develops, coping strategies to deal with the immediate situation on the employment front or on the energy front, and then it moves ahead in order to a more normal situation. So I think that is largely the explanation for why you're seeing a surge in part-time jobs at this stage and not a surge in full-time jobs.
So, with some industries that are said to be moving towards more flexible contracts, how might this impact the overall stability and resilience of the labor market? And of course, are there any potential risks or benefits that could arise from this shift?
I think the answer there must be that inevitably, when you get the business cycle unfolding as it is in South Africa, there will be an uneven impact on certain sectors. There will be winners and losers at any one point in the business cycle. And that is, as you point out, a phenomenon which is also true in South Africa. What we want in South Africa, of course, is much higher levels of employment. As you know, we have a very high unemployment level, especially among the youth, which is common, of course, to our continent, but we feel it very acutely in South Africa. So what we want to do in terms of our labor market structures is to maximize the number of jobs that's created at any one given growth rate, whether it's 1% or 3%. So I think what's important, that what we want to do in South Africa is to inject enough flexibility into the labor market to make that possible. And that will, of course, require negotiation between employers and employees. in order to see that there are whatever checks and balances you need and that you get the best outcome that will maximize employment in the labor market.
Professor, this now brings me to this rather interesting question. Now, you've talked about the need to increase flexibility in contracts and, of course, to have people come around, synergize, talk. And, of course, you also talked about coping mechanism, and that can help with the labor market. But then despite the increase that we see, of course, increase in employment that we see in the labor markets, there's still this official unemployment rate that remains high. So then how do we now reconcile the growth in jobs in these sectors with the persistent high unemployment rates that persists in South Africa?
Well, I think the important point comes back to what we said earlier, that you've got to reduce economic and indeed policy uncertainty. We publish a policy uncertainty index at the university, and it's eased lately, still quite elevated, but it's eased because there have been a few resilient factors emerging in the economy. What we are saying, I think, is, and I think this is also endorsed by government, you've got to get fixed investment levels up. If you want job-rich growth, you've got to get not only government investment up because you need the infrastructure, and I've referred to the energy issues that we are now seeking to resolve with our ESCOM, but also, more importantly, that since the bulk of the jobs have to be created by the private sector, you need to encourage an economic environment which promotes fixed capital formation in the private sector. Fortunately, although it's still not where it ought to be, the level of fixed investment as a proportion to our gross domestic product is beginning to rise slowly, but it's still far short of where we want to be, because if we were where we were, then we wouldn't be only talking about a growth rate of about 1%. So I think there's a big challenge there, that if we want job-rich growth, we've got to create an economic environment which promotes private investor confidence, private investor sentiment, and therefore also the investment that we need. That is true of South Africa, as I think it's true of many other developing countries.
And we hope that these submissions that you have tendered will be taken in strides by the government in concern. But then Raymond Parsons, Professor of Economics, Northwest University Business School, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
As South Africa navigates these challenging times, it is imperative for stakeholders to work together and, of course, to find innovative solutions, stimulate investment, and create an environment that encourages job creation. For economists, it's all about addressing the underlying issues and implementing effective economic policies for overall economic benefits. And that's it on today's edition of Business Edge. Do follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. Do not forget to head to our website, www.newscentral.africa, and equally download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store. My name is Lekan, Onabanjo. Thank you so much for joining us. Tomorrow is another time, 11 a.m. West African time, right here on News Central Television. We will bring you the news at the top of the hour, so don't go anywhere, and we hope to see you some other time.